What is it like to work with Bernie Sanders?
It's exhilarating. It is demanding. It's inspiring. People will sometimes say to me, well, you know him. What's he like?
Yeah.
And I will say, but you know him too.
Is that indeed, is he exactly the same as we have seen him on TV?
That's the thing. Yeah, he is.
Well, his presidential campaign is over, right? Or his campaign, he quit about half a year ago. Are you still anyhow involved within his movement, his campaign, now campaigning for Hillary Clinton?
I am working with him on another project, but I don't do work that's related to the work that he's doing to work on on her behalf.
What project is that, if I may?
Not known yet?
I do know, but nobody else knows. Nobody else knows. He has asked me to work to organize a European trip for him. And so he would very much like to come and visit a number of countries. To room for discussion.
Yeah.
So that's something that I've been doing for him recently.
Wonderful.
I mean, when you tell people that the divide between those at the very top and everyone else, that he would put things in terms of the top 1% or the top 1/10 of 1%. When the top 1/10 of 1% has as much wealth as the bottom 40% of Americans, it is an astonishing figure. When you say that wealth inequality today in the US has returned to the levels of the 1920s that preceded the Great Depression, that's astonishing because, as you said, we had done things over the course of the post-war period leading up to Ronald Reagan to chip away at this problem and to begin to reverse those trends. And then after the early 1980s, we just allowed the problem to not just return, but to return with a vengeance. And so now we're facing levels of income and wealth inequality that we haven't seen in nearly 100 years.
Yep.
That his belief is that the financial system is too big, and if it's too big to fail, it's too big to exist, and if it's too big to regulate and too big to operate and too big to manage for these CEOs that seem not to know what's happening in different departments of their own corporation, then you've got to break it up and make it smaller. You've got to make it safer. So what he wanted to do was just simply reinstate Glass-Steagall, or a modern 21st century form of Glass-Steagall that separates the riskier behaviors from the more traditional safe banking functions. And and he would always point out that the firms that were considered too big to fail before the crisis are bigger now than they were before we bailed them out because they were too big to fail. And so we've got a problem with this term deficit spending. And it's a label with a pejorative that makes people very anxious because we've been told year after year that there's something wrong with a government. It's behaving badly. It's fiscally irresponsible to run budget deficits. But if you stop and think about it, all it means to say that the government is running a deficit is that it's putting more money into the rest of the economy than it's taking out. So if I run a budget deficit and I'm government, I put in 100 and I take out 90. Okay, now we label that a deficit. I have run a deficit, but guess what? Somebody got 10. Somebody in some other part of the economy is now holding 10 that they wouldn't have otherwise had. What does it mean when I run a budget surplus? People say the government should be in surplus, no deficits, be responsible, collect more than you spend. Okay, let's try that. I'm going to run a surplus. I'm going to collect 100 in taxes. Now I'm going to spend 90. So I have a surplus. But what does the rest of the economy have? The rest of the economy has the deficit because balance sheets have to balance. And so we're so accustomed to thinking in terms of the government being irresponsible when it does this thing called topping up the rest of the economy with money, that we sort of forget that that's exactly what happens when you end up with a trade surplus. If the rest of the world decides to spend more money buying your goods and services than you spend buying theirs, they put in 100 buying your stuff, you only spend 90 on their stuff. What do you call it? You call it a trade surplus. How come you use the word surplus when the rest of the world does it, but you use the word deficit when I do it, you're ending up with 10 either way. It has the same macroeconomic effect in terms of the financial assets that you get, but we've labeled these things in a really unhelpful way that causes us to love the idea of one and hate the idea of the other. If we had President Trump,
it's good to know that from next week on, we will recruit new interviewers for Room for Discussion from January on. So you can, if you're interested, for example, in interviewing Ms. Kelton or maybe Bernie Sanders within a few months, then please apply and send your CV plus motivational letter to hr@cefa.nl. For now, I would like a very, very warm applause for Professor Stephanie Kelton.
Thank you. That was fun.